There is a law written in the oldest wood in the world that says love, when true enough, becomes something the earth itself will protect. Most people do not know this. Dorian Voss did not know this. He knew other things. He knew the value of the right moment. He knew that a kingdom without an heir is a kingdom already moving toward a different future, and he had spent the last decades preparing to become that future. What he did not know was that the forest remembers everything. Her name was Mave Ashwood, and she had been called many things over the many years she had stood in the center of difficult rooms. The Luna of the Ashwood Kingdom, beloved by many, hated by many others, a barren queen, unable to give the king an heir, not a real Luna. It was said by no one directly, and by everyone indirectly. She suffered in silence for decades because of it. But now, at 58 years old, she carried the answer to every whispered word. She had been carrying it for weeks. 5 answers to be precise, each with a heartbeat, each with a name she had not yet given them, each moving in the deep, dark warmth inside her with the quiet certainty of things that know they are coming into the world regardless of what any council has to say about it. The Alpha King's quintuplets. What she did not know was that on that morning, she would walk into the great hall of Ashwood Keep for the last time before everything changed. Her kingdom, which should have vibrated with the news, decided she was cursed. After all, she was a pregnant Luna at 58, and old magic is the only thing that could break the laws of nature. She would flee before nightfall. She needed to protect the king's quintuplets, conceived in her womb. But she did not know that the forest had been awake since noon. All she knew, as she left that hall alone with 5 impossible heartbeats beneath her ribs, was that certain things cannot be taken from you by a petition. Certain things can only be confirmed. The forest was about to confirm everything. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories. And you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. That morning, before the council meeting, before the word legitimacy had been spoken aloud in the great hall, Caleum had kissed her forehead and told her he would be back before nightfall. She had watched him ride off to the east toward Greymere, a fabricated report, though neither of them knew it yet. It had been a good morning. The last good morning for some time. The great hall of Ashwood Keep had never felt smaller. Mave stood at the center of it the way she had stood at the center of every hard thing in her life. Spine straight, chin level, hands still at her sides even though her fingers wanted to curl into fists. The banners above her head bore the silver wolf sigil she had stitched back together with her own hands after the great fire. The faces looking at her were faces she knew. Every line, every scar, every carefully arranged expression of neutrality that meant, in a room like this, we are watching to see which way the wind blows before we choose a side. She had learned that lesson 30 years ago and had never forgotten it. At the head of the long council table, Dorian Voss sat with the stillness of a man who had been waiting a very long time for a moment and had practiced his expression for it. 43 years of calculated patience had carved something sharp into the planes of his face. His dark eyes moved to hers and held there, steady and unreadable, the way a wolf holds a point just before it moves. Beside him, Wren sat slightly back from the table. Younger, less certain. He hadn't managed to look directly at Mave since she walked in. She noticed. She filed it somewhere careful, behind her eyes, where she kept things that might matter later. Caleum should have been beside her. That was the first wrong thing, the thing that told her, before a single word was spoken, that this meeting was not what it had been announced to be. Caleum would sooner walk barefoot across the northern ice fields than allow a council to convene about her legitimacy without standing at her side. Either Dorian had called this without his knowledge, or someone had made certain he couldn't be here today. She filed that too and kept her face still. The matter before this council, Dorian said, his voice smooth as riverstone, is one of succession and of legitimacy. The word landed like a blade in wood, clean, deliberate, designed to stick. Luna Mave. Elder Cora's voice came from the far end of the table, the title held at arm's length. 30 years is a long time. The pack has been patient. The Alpha King has been... A pause. Devoted. Devoted. As though Caleum's love for her was an eccentricity to be managed, rather than the bedrock on which this entire kingdom stood. A Luna who cannot provide, Dorian continued, leaning forward slightly, places a kingdom on sand. This council has a responsibility. I am with child. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Mave had ever heard. She had not planned to say it like this. She and Caleum had planned to announce it together, his hand in hers, his voice beside hers, when the healer Cirrus had confirmed what Mave had barely dared to believe. She still carried the image of him in that moment. The Alpha King of Ashwood sitting on the cold floor of the healer's chamber, both hands cradling her face, pressing his forehead gently to her belly. Not speaking, not trying to speak, just breathing, making a sound so low and broken and full of something that had no name in any language. 30 years of hoping, finally finding a place to land. But Caleum was not here, and Dorian had just said cannot provide in that smooth voice, and 30 years of standing still had reached some kind of limit. 5, she said, into the silence. Quintuplets. 5 heirs of the Ashwood line. The ripple that moved through the room this time was large. Council members exchanged glances. Elder Cora's hand stilled on the table. Ren went a color she could not name, something between shock and what might, in another man, have been relief. Dorian was quiet for one long moment. Then he smiled. Small. Careful. The smile of a man who has just seen a problem become a different kind of problem. One he has already begun to solve. 5, he said softly. At 58, when no pregnancy has come in 30 years of trying. He looked around the table, his gaze gentle, almost sorrowful, and Mave felt the cold move from her stomach to her chest. I think this council has a responsibility to ask the difficult questions that love makes harder to see clearly. What questions? Mave said. Not a question, a warning. The healers of the old records, Dorian said, each word placed with care. Speak of one circumstance in which such a thing becomes possible at 58. A circumstance that involves not biology, but... A pause. Old magic. The kind that leaves marks on the natural order. The kind this council has an obligation to investigate before those pups are registered as heirs to the Ashwood throne. The room went completely still. Mave stood in the center of it and felt, for the first time in 30 years, the specific vertigo of ground shifting beneath feet she had believed were planted on bedrock. They were going to take this from her. These 5 small lives, arrived after 30 years of waiting and grief and hope that had nearly worn itself to nothing, turned into a weapon aimed at everything she had built. She looked at Ren. His hands were flat on the table, his shoulders rigid with the stillness of someone holding himself back. From speaking, perhaps, or from leaving. He didn't choose this, she thought, and stored it. Then she looked at Dorian and understood clearly. This council had not been called to discuss her pregnancy. It had been called because Dorian already knew about it, had known for 3 weeks, and had used every one of those days building the architecture of what came next. She found her footing on the new ground. This council has no authority over the Luna of Ashwood without the Alpha King present, she said, her voice quiet and absolute. Not custom, not tradition. Law, written in the Ashwood Compact of the founding generation, which I have read more carefully than anyone else in this room. She turned from the table and walked toward the door. When my husband returns, we will have this conversation together. Until then... She paused at the ancient frame, one hand resting on the cold stone, the 5 small heartbeats steady beneath her ribs like drums. I suggest this council consider very carefully what it is trying to do, and whether it is prepared to answer for it. She walked out into the corridor without looking back, but she had not taken 10 steps before she heard it. A voice she had not expected, low and urgent, from the shadow of the side passage to her left. "My lady." It was Everett, Caleum's most trusted counselor, his face drawn tight with something that was not quite fear, but was the closest she had ever seen him come to it. He pressed a folded note into her hands, his eyes moving to the corridor behind her. "The king did not ask for this meeting. He doesn't know what happened. And my lady—" He lowered his voice to almost nothing. "The eastern boundary reports were fabricated. Dorian sent the king to the Greymere outpost on false information. He will not return before nightfall." Mave looked at the note, broke the seal, read it in 4 seconds. They know about the pups. The healer Cirrus was questioned this morning. Dorian has already drafted the petition for a legitimacy trial. It will be filed before the king returns. Once filed, the pups cannot be registered without a full council ruling, which Dorian controls. You have until nightfall. She folded the note carefully, pressed it flat between her palms, felt the 5 small heartbeats beneath her ribs, steady and unafraid, as if they already knew something she was only beginning to understand. "Thank you, Everett," she said. Then she turned, not toward the royal chambers, not toward the healer's wing, not toward any of the places Aluna was supposed to go when a council turned against her, but toward the eastern passage and the wall beyond it, and the dark line of the forest where the torchlight ended and the old trees began. Somewhere in the deep wood, in the part where noon looked like dusk and dusk looked like the beginning of the world, something vast and patient opened one eye. It had been waiting 30 years. It recognized what was coming. And in the oldest language, the one made of root and rain and the memory of the first wolves, it began to prepare. The eastern passage smelled like cold stone and old torch smoke, and Mave moved through it the way she had learned to move through hard things, without hesitation, without looking back. She had gone to her chambers first. 4 minutes, no more. She had learned long ago that preparation is not panic. It is the difference between surviving and not. She pulled on the worn leather traveling boots, the dark wool cloak, the small satchel she had kept packed at the back of her wardrobe for 3 years, without ever letting herself think about why. Aluna, who has lived through as much as she had, does not keep a packed bag out of pessimism. She keeps it out of clarity. The note from Everett was folded against her heart. Until nightfall. That was what she had. The length of a winter afternoon, the width of a lie about boundary reports, the distance between Caleum and the truth. It was not much. It was enough. The forest received her without ceremony. One moment she was on the frozen path beyond the keep's eastern wall, torchlit stone behind her, the faint sound of the keep's evening bells beginning to stir. The next, the trees closed around her like a held breath, and the world became pine and silence and the deep mineral smell of soil that had never been turned by human hands. Mave exhaled slowly. The cold air filled her lungs and settled something in her chest that the great hall had unsettled, some core of stillness that was hers, that no council and no legitimacy trial and no carefully practiced smile across a long table could touch. Beneath her ribs, the 5 heartbeats stirred. She pressed one hand to her belly through the wool of her cloak. "I know," she said quietly, to no one who could hear her and to the 5 small lives that already could. "We're moving. It's all right." She was not certain it was all right, but Aluna does not communicate uncertainty to her pack, even when her pack is 5 wolf pups not yet born into the world, and old habits run deeper than fear. She had been walking for nearly an hour, the keep long out of sight behind her, when the forest changed. It was not dramatic. It was not the crack of thunder or the sudden appearance of something terrible. It was subtler than that. The way the light shifted, golden gray afternoon becoming something older and more amber, as if the trees ahead were remembering a different season. The air thickened slightly, the way it does before rain, except there were no clouds above the canopy. The soil beneath her boots grew darker, richer, the frost pulling back from the earth as though the ground here maintained its own warmth. Mave slowed. Ahead, where the path narrowed between two ancient oaks whose roots had grown so long and so intertwined that they had become a single thing, a figure sat on a fallen log with the cheerful incongruity of someone who had been expecting her. He was old, truly old, the kind of old that has moved past merely looking it and arrived somewhere else entirely, somewhere that involves a great many opinions and the complete freedom to express all of them. He was small and round, and wrapped in a coat that appeared to have been assembled from several different coats at different points in his life, without any of them being consulted. His beard was gray and enthusiastic. At his feet, an assortment of small pouches, dried herbs, and what appeared to be an argument with a pine cone were arranged with obscure personal logic. He looked up at Mave with sharp, amber eyes. "You're late," he said. Mave stopped walking. "I beg your pardon." "Late." He gestured at the forest around them with one gnarled hand. "The wood's been awake since noon. Very inconvenient. The moss on the north side of the old oak has been behaving erratically. That only happens when something significant is on its way." He peered at her. "You're significantly pregnant. That's probably it." "I don't know you," Mave said. "Bramble?" he said, as though this explained everything. He picked up the pine cone, appeared to reach some conclusion about it, and set it down again. "Omega of the Greywood, former healer, current recluse, reluctant prophet on alternating Tuesdays. You're the Luna of Ashwood Keep. You've been walking east for—" He tilted his head. "An hour and 14 minutes. You've got 5 pups in there who are going to be an absolute menace once they figure out how paws work. And something behind you is already moving." Mave went very still. "What do you mean moving?" "I mean, Dorian Voss sent 2 trackers into the eastern wood approximately 40 minutes ago." Bramble stood, his joints registering a formal complaint about the process. "They're good trackers. Fortunately, I'm better, and the forest and I have an arrangement." He looked at her with the directness of someone who has lived alone long enough to have no patience left for indirection. "You can stand here deciding whether to trust me, which is reasonable but time-consuming, or you can walk with me now and be suspicious on the way. The forest has a place for you. It's been preparing it. I'd rather you see it before those trackers pick up your scent at the Oak Crossing." Mave looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked. Bramble set a pace that was surprisingly quick for someone his age and architectural complexity, moving through the forest with the ease of a man who has learned every root and hollow by long acquaintance. He talked while he walked, because silence, he explained, was for people who didn't have anything useful to say, and he nearly always had something useful to say, though he acknowledged that not everyone appreciated the distinction. "The forest has been in this state before," he said, ducking beneath a low branch that Mave had to maneuver around considerably more carefully. "Twice that I know of. Once 300 years ago, once before my time but recorded in the bark. The trees keep records. Most people don't know that. Very rude of them not to ask. And both times, it was the same condition. A Luna of particular significance, carrying legitimate heirs, threatened by a challenge to that legitimacy." He paused. "The forest doesn't involve itself in politics. It involves itself in bloodlines. There's a difference." "You're telling me the forest knows who my pups are," Mave said. "The forest knows what they are," Bramble corrected. "Which is more important?" They walked on. The amber light deepened around them, and the air grew warmer by degrees. Not the warmth of fire, but the warmth of living things, of root systems, and old growth, and the specific heat of soil that has never gone cold. The sound of the wind in the upper canopy was low and rhythmic, almost like breathing. Beneath Mave's ribs, the 5 heartbeats steadied. slowed, settled into something that felt unmistakably like recognition. "They know this place," she said softly. "Not yet," Bramble said. "But they will." He stopped at the edge of a clearing. In its center, a spring rose from between the roots of the oldest tree Mave had ever seen, vast and silver-barked, its canopy spreading so wide that the clearing existed entirely in its shelter. The grass around the spring was deep and green, untouched by frost, and around the base of the tree, the roots had grown and curved to form something that was almost a shelter. Mave stood at the edge of it and felt the tears arrive before she had decided to cry. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, though she was exhausted, from something that had no cleaner name than recognition. The feeling of a place that has been waiting, and a person who has been walking toward it without knowing. Behind them, distant but distinct, a howl rose from the direction of the keep. Caleum. She would have known it anywhere. After 30 years, his voice in wolf form lived in her bones the same way his voice in language did. Recognizable before the sound had finished forming, the way you know a hand in the dark by its weight and warmth before you see it. He had returned. He had found the empty chambers, the note from Everett, the truth about the false boundary reports. He was coming. And from deep in the wood behind her, from the direction of the trackers, closer than she had expected, came the sound of something moving fast through frozen underbrush. Bramble looked at the tree, looked at Mave, looked at the direction of the approaching sound with the expression of a man performing a rapid calculation. "In," he said. "Now. The law of the fifth howl isn't going to activate itself." Mave looked at him sharply. "You know about the law." "I wrote the record of the law," Bramble said with the mild dignity of someone correcting a minor factual error. "In 1743, it was a very good year for documentation." He gestured at the clearing. "In. Please. I say please approximately 4 times per decade. Don't waste it." Mave walked into the clearing. The moment her feet crossed the root line of the ancient tree, the forest exhaled. Caleum Ashwood had ruled for 31 years, and in those years he had made exactly 3 decisions that had kept him awake past midnight with genuine uncertainty. The first was sending 500 wolves to the northern border during the drought of '09, a gamble that had paid off, but that still, on cold nights, reminded him how thin the line was between bold and reckless. The second was choosing Mave. The third was what he was choosing right now, standing in their empty chambers with Everett's account still ringing in his ears, and a cold, clean fury moving through him like floodwater. Quiet, contained, and capable of taking out everything in its path. "Say it again," he said. His voice was very level. Everett said it again. The fabricated reports. The council convened in Caleum's absence. Dorian's petition for a legitimacy trial, drafted and ready to file. The trackers sent into the eastern wood 40 minutes after Mave left the keep. With each sentence, the fury grew colder and more precise. Not the hot rage of a man surprised. Caleum had not been entirely surprised by Dorian for years now. What moved through him was something more focused than rage. The particular feeling of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has just been given a reason to stop. "Where are the trackers now?" "In the eastern wood," Everett said. "2 of them. Dorian's best." Caleum was already moving toward the door. "Your Majesty." Everett kept pace beside him, his voice careful. "If you ride into that forest tonight without—" "I'm not riding." Caleum was already pulling off his outer coat, already feeling the shift beginning in the base of his spine, the deep cellular change that 31 years of discipline had given him complete and absolute control over, except on the occasions when someone threatened what he loved, at which point discipline became a tool rather than a constraint, and the wolf became a different kind of precision instrument. "I'm faster without the horse in deep forest. You know that. The council can wait." He paused at the window that faced the eastern tree line. The forest was dark now, the last gray light fading from the canopy. Somewhere in there, Mave was moving. He could feel the bond, steady and alive, pulling like a compass needle. She was not hurt. She was not afraid. She was, in the particular quality of her presence he had learned over 30 years, determined, which meant she had a plan, or had found something, or both. The bond also told him something else, faint but unmistakable. The 5 small lives beneath her ribs were calm, calmer than they had been all day. Something in the forest was keeping them calm. He filed that in the part of his mind reserved for things he did not yet understand but intended to, and looked at Everett. Dorian files nothing before morning. I don't care how. Delay it. Cite procedural requirements. Invoke the 72-hour review clause in the compact. You know the law better than he does. Use it. Everett stood straighter. Yes, Your Majesty. And Everett. Caleum's voice dropped to something quieter. Wren came to see me before I left for Greymere. I thought it was a courtesy visit. I'm reconsidering that. Everett's expression shifted. Careful. Processing. You think he was warning you? I think he didn't say anything useful, but he made a point of being in the same room as me before I left. Caleum turned back to the window. Find out. Carefully. Then he shifted, and the Alpha King of Ashwood came apart and reformed as something older and faster and far less interested in politics, and he was through the window and across the frozen courtyard and into the trees before the cold air had finished moving in his wake. The forest closed around him. He ran. He ran the way he had run with Mave in the early years, when they were young and the world was mostly made of possibility, through the deep pines, over the frozen ground, following the bond's steady pull like a thread made of 30 years of chosen love. The tracker's scent hit him at the oak crossing. 2 wolves, moving parallel, converging on a point ahead. He adjusted his course. He reached the first tracker in 4 minutes. The wolf looked up, recognized what was standing over him, and went immediately and completely still. Caleum did not hurt him. He had no interest in hurting either of them. They were wolves following orders, not the author of those orders. And he was not in the habit of punishing the instrument for the will of the hand. He simply stood over the tracker in the dark of the forest and let 31 years of alpha authority settle into the space between them like weather. Go back, he said. Both of you, tonight. The tracker went back. The second, 100 yards east, heard the exchange through their pack link and made the same decision with slightly more speed. Caleum ran on. The forest changed before he saw the clearing, the air warming by degrees, the frost pulling back from the soil, the amber quality of the light telling him he had crossed into something old. He slowed, not from caution, from the sudden, overwhelming sense of something that asked, not in words, but in the specific language of ancient spaces, to be approached with care. He stepped into the clearing. Mave was sitting against the roots of the great silver tree, her cloak wrapped around her, her face tipped up toward the canopy. She looked tired. She looked like herself, entirely, unmistakably, infuriatingly herself. And the sight of her hit him somewhere below the sternum with the same force it always had, even after 30 years, even now, perhaps most of all now. Beside her, a small and extremely opinionated-looking old man was engaged in what appeared to be a one-sided argument with a piece of bark. Caleum shifted back, stood at the edge of the clearing, found his voice. Mave. She looked at him across the clearing, and her eyes did what they always did when she looked at him, something that had no performance in it, no calculation, nothing but the 30-year fact of them. You found me, she said. I will always find you, he said. You know that. The old man looked up from his bark, looked at Caleum, looked at Mave, looked back at Caleum with the evaluating amber gaze of someone running a rapid assessment. Bramble said. Good bone structure. Reasonable instincts. Arrived without destroying anything. He tilted his head. I'll allow it. Caleum looked at Mave. "Who is this?" "Bramble," she said, with the tone of someone who has already made peace with the fact that this requires more context than is currently available. "He wrote the record of the law of the fifth howl," Mave continued, "in 1743, which he mentions he considers a very good year for documentation." Bramble pointed at Caleum. "You're going to need to howl. Specifically, the mate recognition call, third cadence, the one your grandfather's generation called the finding howl. Most alphas your age have never used it because they've never needed to." He paused. "Have you ever used it?" "A beat." "No," Caleum said. Bramble sat back with the expression of a teacher who expected this answer and finds it only mildly exhausting. "Of course not." He picked up his bark again. "Well, that's what we're working on next." From deep within the roots of the ancient tree, where the spring rose and the grass stayed green against all reason, something stirred. A warmth that had nothing to do with fire. A sound that had nothing to do with wind. 5 heartbeats, steady as drums. Caleum moved to Mave's side and sat beside her in the roots of the oldest tree in the Greywood forest, and she leaned into him the way she always had, not like someone who needed holding up, but like someone who had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of all available options, to be exactly here. He put his arm around her. The forest breathed. "Tell me everything," he said. She told him. The morning after Caleum arrived in the Greywood clearing, Bramble announced that they would be staying for some time, and that if anyone had objections, they were welcome to take them up with the ancient tree, which had been managing this forest since before the Ashwood Compact existed and had no interest in anyone's schedule. Caleum looked at Mave. Mave looked at the roots that had curved overnight into something unmistakably more sheltered than they had been the evening before. A hollow in the base of the great silver tree, lined with deep moss, warm in the way that living things are warm, wide enough for 2 people and whatever an omega of the Greywood decided to drag inside it by way of provisions. "The forest closed the path back," Caleum said. Not a question. Before dawn. Bramble was already arranging his incomprehensible collection of pouches and dried herbs along a root shelf with the focused energy of a man settling in for a long stay. "The law activates fully once the Luna enters the root circle. The wood holds until the finding howl is completed correctly." He paused. "I did mention the howl last night." "You mentioned it once and then went to sleep." "I sleep efficiently. It's a skill." Bramble held a dried bundle up to the light, decided something about it, and set it aside. "The howl cannot be forced or rushed. It rises when the alpha's intention is fully formed. Not the intention to retrieve what is his, mark you, but the intention to choose, again, consciously, with full knowledge." He glanced at Caleum with amber eyes that were doing considerably more work than his mild tone suggested. 31 years of marriage, and you'd think that would be simple. And yet, Caleum's jaw shifted in a way that was not quite irritation and not quite amusement. "And yet," he agreed. Mave, sitting against the warm curve of the roots with her cloak spread across her lap, pressed her palm flat against her belly and felt the 5 heartbeats move in response. A ripple of recognition, like 5 small questions asked at once. They had been more active since dawn. Not anxious, curious. The forest seemed to interest them in the way that new things interest creatures who are still mostly instinct and potential, turning toward warmth and sound and the deep mineral smell of the spring with a collective attention that Mave was beginning to recognize as distinct in each of them. Colt, the eldest, moved with a steadiness she could already identify. A slow, deliberate press against her ribs that felt like a wolf testing weight before committing to a step. Flint barely moved at all, but when he did, it was swift and precise, there and gone. Rue, the only girl, the one who had been still all through the previous terrible day in the Great Hall, had been active since the moment they entered the clearing, as though the forest had said something that interested her specifically. Bram moved constantly, enthusiastically, and apparently without any concern for the structural integrity of Mave's ribcage, and Wick, the smallest, the stubborn white one, had planted himself against her left side with the immovable energy of a creature that has decided on a position and sees no compelling reason to revise it. The smallest one keeps pressing on the same spot, Mave said. Bramble looked over with the professional attention of someone whose expertise is being called upon. Which side? Left. He nodded slowly. That one's going to be trouble. You can tell that from a heartbeat? I can tell that from a posture, Bramble said. No tactical reason to be on the left. It's less defended. He's there because he chose it, which means he already has opinions about positioning. A pause. I had a wolf like that in my apprenticeship once. Absolute menace. Turned into the best tracker the Greywood has produced in 2 centuries. He considered this. Still a menace, though. Caleum, who had been crouched at the edge of the spring studying the water with the focused attention of a man who processes difficult things by looking at something that isn't the difficult thing, stood and turned back to them. The morning light through the canopy caught the lines of his face. The familiar ones, the ones Mave knew the way she knew her own hands, and the newer ones that 31 years of carrying a kingdom had put there alongside them. Tell me about the law, he said to Bramble. All of it, not the summary. Bramble settled onto his root shelf with the preparatory energy of a man who has been waiting to be asked this question and has strong feelings about it. The law of the 5th howl predates the compact by at least 4 centuries. It exists in forest record in 7 locations across the Greywood and has been documented in written form twice. Once by a healer in 1412 who got most of it wrong, and once by me in 1743 who got all of it right. He accepted no modesty about this. The law activates under one condition. A Luna carrying 4 or more legitimate heirs enters the root circle of a Greywood anchor tree under threat to those heirs' recognition. The forest holds her, not as a prisoner, as a ward. The distinction is essential. How is she freed? Caleum's voice was even and focused. The mate recognition howl, 3rd cadence. It must be genuine. The forest knows the difference, believe me. Several alphas in the historical record tried to fake it, and the wood was not impressed. Bramble folded his hands. When the howl is completed correctly, the forest releases the ward and does something else as well. He let that sit for a moment. Caleum waited. He was, Mave had always thought, the only man she knew who could wait as well as she could. It records, Bramble said. The Greywood writes the howl into its bark. The identity of the alpha, the identity of the Luna, the number of heirs. It becomes part of the forest record. Permanent, irrefutable. The amber eyes moved between them. No legitimacy trial in any pack law in existence can override a Greywood record, because the forest is not a council. It is not a court. It is older than both, and it does not lie. The silence that followed had a particular quality. The specific silence of something large and important settling into place. Mave looked at Caleum. He was looking at her with the expression she knew best, the one with no performance in it, the one that had been the same since the first year and had only deepened with time. She felt the bond hum between them, warm and steady. So Dorian's petition, she said quietly. Becomes irrelevant, Bramble confirmed, the moment the howl is recorded. He can file whatever he likes. The forest will have already answered. A pause. The difficulty, of course, is that the howl must come from a place of true rechoosing. It cannot be motivated by strategy. The forest knows the difference, Caleum finished. You're a quick study, Bramble allowed. From Mave's left side, Wick pressed hard against her ribs. She pressed back gently. Then we wait, she said. Bramble nodded once. Then he picked up a piece of bark from his shelf, examined it with great attention, and said, without looking up, also, I should mention that Dorian has sent a second party, larger than the first. They'll reach the outer forest boundary before nightfall. The warm air of the clearing moved slowly. Somewhere in the upper canopy, a bird called and was answered. Caleum looked toward the place where the path had been. "Let them come to the forest," he said, with a quietness that was not calm so much as it was entirely settled. "They won't reach her." Bramble looked up from his bark, looked at Caleum with the amber eyes that had been reading forests and people for longer than anyone at Ashwood Keep had been alive. "No," he agreed, "they won't." And deep in the roots of the silver tree, slow as sap and certain as seasons, the forest began to write. Back at Ashwood Keep, the corridors had taken on the specific atmosphere of a place where something important is being decided in rooms that are not the ones where important things are supposed to be decided. Everett had spent the night doing what Caleum had asked, which was to say, he had spent the night being extremely precise about procedural requirements in a way that was entirely legal, entirely frustrating to Dorian, and entirely invisible as a strategy unless you knew exactly what you were looking at. The 72-hour review clause had been invoked at midnight. The petition was delayed. The filing clerk, a young wolf named Petra who had worked under Everett for 6 years and understood perfectly what she was being asked to do and why, had developed a sudden and thorough interest in ensuring every form was complete to the letter before any stamp was applied. Dorian had not slept. Everett could tell, watching him cross the great hall at dawn with the controlled fury of a man who has found his precise instrument slightly off-center, that the delay had done its work. Not enough to stop him, but enough to shift his timing. And timing was everything in a move like this. Wren had also not slept. Everett found him in the eastern gallery just after dawn, standing at the window that faced the forest, still in the clothes he'd worn to the council meeting the day before. He was holding a cup of cold tea with the unseeing focus of a man who had forgotten he was holding it. "Your brother is going to file before the king returns," Everett said, coming to stand beside him. Not accusation, observation. Wren was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the forest was dark and still under a pale winter sky. "He's not wrong," Wren said at last, "that the succession is a real problem. The pack needs to know the line continues." A pause. "He's wrong about everything else." Everett waited. "I went to see the king before he left for Greymere," Wren said. "I told myself I was being courteous." A short, humorless breath. "I knew about the reports. I didn't know they were fabricated until afterward, when Dorian was too pleased with himself to hide it entirely." He set the cold tea down on the windowsill. "I'm not like him. I need you to know that." "What I need to know," Everett said carefully, "is what you're going to do about it." Wren turned from the window. He looked, Everett thought, like a man who had spent a very long night arriving at a decision and was not entirely comfortable with how long it had taken. "Dorian has a witness," Wren said. "Someone he's convinced to testify that the pregnancy is the result of old magic. A hedge healer from the Southern Territory who claims to have records of a ritual performed near Ashwood Keep 14 months ago." He paused. "The records are fabricated. I've seen them. I know what real ritual documentation looks like, and these aren't it. The ink is wrong, the format is wrong. The seal is from a lineage that died out 60 years ago." Everett went very still. "You have proof of the fabrication." "I have enough to create doubt, enough to make a council hesitate." Wren's jaw was tight. "It's not everything, but it's something." "Why are you telling me this?" The question sat between them in the pale gallery light. Outside, the forest held its silence. Somewhere in its deep green dark, the Luna of Ashwood was sheltered in roots older than the kingdom, and the Alpha King was learning to howl in a language he had never needed before. Wren looked at Everett with the specific expression of a man who is done carrying something alone. "Because she stitched the banner back together after the Great Fire," he said. "I was 11 years old. I watched her do it. My father, Dorian's father, said it was undignified, that a Luna shouldn't do servant's work." A pause. "She told him that a Luna does what needs doing, and that caring for the symbols of your people is never beneath you. He picked up the cold tea, looked at it, and set it back down. I've been waiting 27 years to do something with that, he said. I think this is it. Everett looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating steadiness of a man who has spent 30 years in service to a king and has learned, through long practice, the difference between a person telling you what you want to hear and a person telling you the truth at considerable personal cost. He saw the truth. Come with me, Everett said. There's a clerk named Petra who is going to need company for the next 48 hours, and the procedural review just became considerably more interesting. Wren followed him down the corridor without hesitation. Behind them, in the great hall, Dorian stood at the head of the long table where yesterday he had smiled his careful smile, and looked at the forest through the high eastern window with eyes that were no longer entirely confident. Something had shifted. He could feel it. The way a wolf feels weather, not seeing it yet, but knowing it was coming, knowing it would be larger than expected. He did not yet know about Wren. He did not yet know about the Greywood record. He did not yet know that the forest had been writing since dawn. By the time he knew all three, it would be too late to change what had already been set in motion. But he did not know that either. And so he stood at the window with his careful face arranged into its careful stillness, and planned and waited, and believed he was still the one holding the map. He had always been good at maps. He had never accounted for a forest that drew its own. 3 days in the Greywood clearing had given Caleum a thorough education in several things he had not previously needed to know. He had learned, for instance, that Bram, the Revo one, the enthusiastic one, the one Mave had taken to calling that one with a tone of exhausted affection, had already developed a strong opinion about pine cones and expressed it physically. He had learned that Flint moved in the night without waking anyone, a skill that was impressive and mildly unsettling in a pup not yet born. He had learned that Rue settled whenever Mave hummed, low and wordless, and that Colt always pressed toward Caleum's side of the roots when he was near, which Bramble observed with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose theory is being confirmed. He had also learned that the finding howl was considerably more complicated than it sounded. Again, Bramble said, from his root shelf, not looking up from the strip of bark he was annotating with a stick of charcoal. He had been annotating it for 2 days. Caleum had stopped asking what it said. Caleum stood at the edge of the spring in the early morning light and tried again. The sound that came from him was correct in structure. He was an alpha king. He had been howling since he was 4 years old. He knew every cadence in the pack vocabulary the way a musician knows scales. The third cadence, the mate recognition form, was not technically difficult. He had simply never had occasion to use it because he had never needed to declare Mave his mate to a force outside of himself. The bond had always been sufficient. The bond was internal, private, woven into the fabric of 31 years of chosen mornings and difficult evenings and every ordinary, extraordinary day between them. The forest wanted something different. The forest wanted the howl that meant I choose her not because fate said so, but because I have seen her fully, and I choose her still. The first 2 attempts had produced a sound that was close, but not correct. Like a word spoken in a language you know well, but have never said aloud. The shape right, but the weight missing. Bramble had said after the second attempt, "You're thinking about the petition. Stop thinking about the petition." "I'm not thinking about the petition. You're thinking about Dorian." A pause. "That's essentially the same thing." Then stop. Bramble had set down his bark and looked at Caleum with the directness that was, Caleum was learning, his version of kindness. The howl doesn't come from the part of you that rules. It comes from the part of you that loved her before you knew what to do with it. Go back there. Caleum had gone back there, or tried to. He was not, by nature or by 31 years of practice, a man who lived easily in the past. The present required too much of him, but he stood at the spring's edge now in the early quiet, before Bramble was fully awake, and before Mave stirred in the warm roots, and he let the present go for a moment. He thought about the morning, early in their first year, when she had come to find him in the training yard before dawn, because she had heard, through the careful network of names and relationships she had been quietly building for 6 months, that the youngest family in the Thornwood Quarter hadn't eaten properly in 2 weeks. Not because she wanted him to fix it, because she had already fixed it and wanted him to know how she had done it so they could build a system that prevented it from happening again. She had been 28 years old, standing in the pre-dawn dark with cold hands and absolutely unshakable purpose, and he had looked at her and understood, with the clarity of something fundamental shifting into place, that he had not yet begun to deserve her, but intended to spend the rest of his life in the attempt. The howl rose before he decided to let it. It rose from the place he had gone back to, from that pre-dawn training yard, from 31 years of attempting, from the floor of Cyrus's chamber 3 weeks ago, from the look on her face when she had said, "I am with child," into a room that did not deserve to receive it. It was not loud. It was not the commanding declaration of a king marking territory. It was something much older and much quieter than that. The sound of a wolf who has found his only true north and is telling the forest, plainly and without strategy, that he knows it. The great silver tree exhaled. The sound moved through the canopy the way warmth moves, spreading outward, rising, dissipating into the cold morning air. Where it passed over the roots, the bark shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. A fine grain of change, like ink absorbed into deep wood. The forest was writing. From the warm hollow behind him, Mave made a sound that was not quite awake and not quite asleep. A small, involuntary response to the howl that moved through the bond like an echo. He had heard that sound before, in the deepest part of many nights, and it still did what it had always done to the center of his chest. Bramble emerged from his sleeping nook in the roots with the unhurried energy of a man who had been awake for some time but saw no reason to announce it. He looked at the tree, at the almost imperceptible change in the bark, at Caleum. "Better?" he said. "Better," Caleum repeated. "The word you're using is better. Would you prefer adequate?" Bramble settled onto his root shelf and picked up his bark annotation. "The record is begun. The forest has accepted the first movement of the howl. There are 3 more." He chose a new piece of charcoal. "You'll complete 1 per day. That is how the law works. It cannot be rushed. It must be genuine each time, which means each day you must return to a different truth." He paused. "Today you went to the beginning. Tomorrow is the middle." "The middle. The hardest part," Bramble said without particular inflection. "The part where you chose her not when it was new, but when it was difficult. Every long love has that part. It is, in my documentation, the part most alphas avoid thinking about." He tilted his head slightly. "You don't look like an avoider." "I'm not." "Good. Back to the bark, because the forest will know if you are." Behind them, from the warm root hollow, Mave's voice arrived, slightly rough with sleep and entirely composed. "Is the tree recording, or are you two just out there being philosophical at dawn again?" "Recording," Caleum said. A pause. Then quieter, in the tone she reserved for things that mattered. "Good." Wick pressed hard against her left side. She pressed back. The morning settled around the clearing like something that had decided, after long consideration, to be gentle. At Ashwood Keep, Dorian had stopped sleeping and started planning instead, which was, Everett reflected, a dangerous transition in a man of his particular intelligence. The 72-hour review had bought them time, not immunity. The petition would be filed by dawn of the 4th day, regardless of Petra's extraordinary dedication to procedural thoroughness. Dorian had found a secondary clerk, someone Everett didn't know, which meant he had been building his own parallel infrastructure for longer than anyone had suspected. That realization arrived in Everett's chest like cold water. How long, he thought, has this been prepared? He did not let the thought show. Thoughts that showed were vulnerabilities, and this was not the moment for vulnerabilities. The chamber that functioned as his working room was small and lined with records, which was how he preferred it, surrounded by the documented history of the Pack's decisions, a reminder that everything eventually became record and every choice had to be able to survive the scrutiny of its own consequence. Ren sat across from him, the fabricated ritual documentation spread between them. Ren had been right about the ink. He had been right about the seal. And he had found a third flaw that neither of them had noticed at first, a date reference that cited a lunar cycle that had occurred 18 months after the event the document claimed to record. He was careful, Ren said, but not careful enough. He was confident, Everett said, which was different. Confidence produces a particular kind of error. You stop checking because you've stopped expecting to be wrong. He looked at the false seal, the lineage that had died out 60 years ago, pressed in wax with the unhurried assurance of someone who believed no one would check. He didn't expect anyone to know this lineage was extinct. I only know because my mother was a historian, Ren said. Pack genealogies were her particular interest. She made me memorize lineage trees the way other children memorized songs. A brief, complicated pause. Dorian thought it was useless. He told her so. Another pause. She died when I was 17. He had forgotten about the lineage trees by then. Everett looked at him across the spread of false documents. He thought of what Ren had said in the gallery. I've been waiting 27 years to do something with that. And understood now that the waiting had not been cowardice. It had been the particular patience of a person who grew up in the shadow of someone larger and learned, for survival, to be still, and who had never, in all that time, let the stillness become surrender. The council convenes tomorrow at first light, Everett said. Dorian will present the petition and the false witness. He'll have the neutrals positioned. He's spent weeks on this. Every vote is already calculated. He looked at the documents. We present the flaws in the fabrication as a counterfiling. It won't stop the process immediately, but it creates enough doubt to force an extended review. Which buys the king more time. Which buys the king more time, Everett confirmed. And the forest more time. And the record more time to be completed. He began gathering the documents with careful hands. There is one other thing. Ren waited. The false witness, the hedge healer from the Southern Territory, is currently housed in the East Guest Quarters under Dorian's arrangement. Everett's voice was measured. I would like to speak with her before tomorrow, not to threaten or persuade, simply to... He considered the word carefully. Introduce her to the consequences of what she is being asked to do. Sometimes people who are paid to participate in a wrong thing have not been clearly shown what the wrong thing actually costs. Ren was quiet for a moment. She may not be movable. She may not be, Everett agreed. But she was moved once already, by Dorian, by whatever he offered her. Movement is not her obstacle. Direction is. He stood. Will you come? Ren stood without hesitation. Then he stopped. Everett, if this works, when the king returns, when the pups are recorded... A pause, and in it, the weight of everything the Voss name had been made to mean by one man's ambition. I need you to know that I understand what Dorian has done cannot be undone by my cooperation now. I'm not asking for... Ren. Everett's voice was not unkind. The Luna watched you in that council room. She noticed you didn't look at her. He picked up the documents. She also noticed you were holding yourself back from speaking. I know her. She will have stored both. A slight pause. She is not a woman who confuses the instrument with the hand that directed it, but she will want to see what you do next. Something shifted in Ren's face. Not relief exactly, but the specific quality of a burden being redistributed into something more possible to carry. They walked toward the East Guest Quarters through the keep's quiet corridors, past the silver wolf banners, past the portrait gallery where 3 decades of Ashwood history looked down from the walls, past the place near the east staircase where, if you looked closely at the lower border of the second banner from the left, you could still see the slightly different texture of thread where it had been restitched, by hand, by a Luna who believed that caring for your people's symbols was never beneath you. Ren looked at it as they passed. He did not stop, but his chin came up in a way that had nothing to do with Dorian, and everything to do with something older and more his own. In the east guest quarters, a woman sat by a window with the careful stillness of someone who is pretending not to be afraid. Everett knocked twice, opened the door, and walked in with the calm authority of a man who has 30 years and a righteous cause on his side. "My name is Everett," he said pleasantly. "I think we should talk." On the fourth morning in the Greywood clearing, Caleum stood at the spring before dawn and understood what Bramble had meant about the middle being the hardest part. The first movement of the howl had come from the beginning, the pre-dawn training yard, the woman with cold hands and unshakable purpose. The second had come from the years of abundance, the ones people remembered when they thought of a good rain, the grain reserves, the Thornwood post, the long evenings when the keep felt less like a seat of power and more like a home because she had made it so. The third truth was the one he had not spoken aloud to anyone. Not to Everett, not to Mave, though she knew it the way she knew most things about him. Quietly, without requiring him to say it. The third truth was the winter of 12 years ago. The pack had been fracturing, a territorial dispute that had lasted 3 years and ground everyone involved into something exhausted and suspicious and sharp. Caleum had made a decision that had cost lives. Not many. 3. 3 wolves at the border crossing who had trusted his judgment and died because his judgment had been wrong. He had carried that with the specific private weight that leaders carry things they cannot put down and cannot share, because sharing it feels like distributing a burden that is yours to bear. Mave had found him in the eastern gallery at midnight, 3 days after the crossing. She had not said anything immediately. She had sat beside him on the cold bench and put her hand over his and been still with him, the way the forest was still. Not empty, but full of a different kind of presence. After a long time, she had said, simply, "You are not the only one who carries this. You never were. That is what we agreed to 30 years ago. All of it. Together." He had not been able to speak for a considerable while after that. He had chosen her in that moment with a completeness that the early years, for all their brightness, had not contained. Because choosing someone in the dark, in the wrong, in the weight of something that cannot be fixed, is a different and deeper kind of choosing than choosing them in the light. The howl rose from there. It was quieter than the first 2. Lower. It moved through the clearing without declaration, without the ring of a king marking territory. It moved the way that Winter Midnight had moved, the way her hand over his had moved, carrying the specific weight of a thing that has been tested and has not broken. The silver tree exhaled for the 3rd time. The bark shifted. The record deepened. From the root hollow, Mave was awake. He knew without turning, felt the quality of the bond shift the way it always did when she moved from sleep into full presence. Her attention had a particular warmth that he had learned to recognize in the dark long before he could see her face. "That one was different," she said softly. He turned. She was sitting at the edge of the root hollow with her cloak around her and her palm flat against her belly, and the morning light was doing what it always did to her face, finding the lines that 30 years had put there and making them look like what they were, which was not age, but evidence. "The winter of 12 years ago," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and there was nothing in the nod that required further language. Bramble emerged from his sleeping nook, took one look at the tree, one look at them, and reached for his charcoal with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a well-documented theory prove itself correct. 3, he said. 1 remaining. He began annotating. Tomorrow, at dawn. The 4th truth is the present. Not the past, not the history. Today, this morning. What you know now that you did not know 30 years ago and could not have. He paused over his bark. Most alphas find the first three easier. Because the present requires you to be uncertain, Caleum said. Bramble looked up with something that was the closest he came to open approval. Precisely. The past is known. The present is still forming. He tilted his head toward the root hollow. 5 lives not yet fully in the world. A kingdom that may or may not be in the middle of a legitimacy crisis depending on what Everett has managed. A forest law that has not been completed in 400 years. He paused. Quite a lot of present to stand inside. From Mave's side, Bram executed what felt like a full rotation, which produced an involuntary sound from Mave that was somewhere between a laugh and a complaint. That one, Bramble said without looking up, is going to require an enormous amount of patience from everyone. We're aware, Mave said. I'm noting it for the record. You're noting everything for the record. That is what records are for. He set down his charcoal and looked at her with the amber eyes that carried something warmer than his tone generally admitted. How are you, Mave? Not the Luna, not the mother. You. The question landed differently than the others, direct and personal, the kind that bypasses the composed surface and asks what's underneath. She was quiet for a moment. I'm frightened, she said. Not the fear of the council or the trackers or Dorian's petition. All of that was real, but it was outside her, manageable, something to be navigated. I'm frightened about them. Her hand pressed gently against her belly. Not about whether they're legitimate or whether the forest will record or whether Dorian's petition will be stopped. I'm frightened about being enough, for 5 of them. A pause. I have wanted this for 30 years, and now that it's real, I'm terrified, Caleum said. He had moved to sit beside her without deciding to move, his shoulder against hers. So am I. Bramble looked at them both. Good, the old Omega said, with great firmness. Terrified parents pay attention. Confident parents get surprised. He picked up his charcoal again. I have documented 17 litters in this forest. The ones with terrified parents always did better. A pause. Also, I should mention that Wick has been pressing on your left side for 4 days, because he is already oriented toward the spring. He knows where the water is. He located it from inside the womb. Another pause. That one is going to be extraordinary. Also still a menace. Both things are true simultaneously. Mave laughed. A real one. Full and unguarded. The kind that came from the place below the fear. Caleum felt it move through the bond like warmth through cold stone. Outside the clearing, at the forest boundary, Dorian's second party had been waiting for 3 days. They had not entered. The forest had not permitted it. Not through force, not through anything visible or dramatic. Simply through the specific atmosphere of deep ancient wood that says, without words, not here, not now, not while this is happening. They were still waiting. They would keep waiting. One truth remained. The council chamber at Ashwood Keep had seen 31 years of difficult mornings, but even by its own austere standards, the morning of the 4th day had a particular quality. Dorian sat at the head of the table with the composed precision of a man who has prepared for every contingency and is running through his list one final time. The petition was filed, not at dawn as planned, delayed by Petra's thoroughness until mid-morning, but filed. The false witness, a hedge healer named Sola, sat in the chamber's anteroom waiting to be called. Everything was positioned. What he had not positioned for was Wren sitting on the opposite side of the table. Not behind him, not beside him. Opposite him, with Everett at his right, and 3 documents laid flat on the wood between them. Dorian looked at the documents, looked at his brother. Something moved behind his careful eyes. Not surprise, exactly, because Dorian Voss had trained himself out of surprise decades ago, but a rapid and precise recalculation. The expression on his face did not change. The quality of his stillness changed, which was more telling. Wren, he said. One word, the way you say a word you are deciding the meaning of. Wren did not look away. He had the particular steadiness of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has chosen, on a specific morning, to be done with it. The seal on the ritual documentation is from the Kara lineage. The Kara lineage has been extinct since 1963. He touched the first document, the genealogical record their mother had made him memorize. The date reference on page 3 cites the harvest moon of the 42nd year of the Ashwood reign. That moon occurred 14 months after the event the document claims to record. He touched the second. The ink composition is a southern blend not produced in this region before 11 years ago. He touched the third. This is a spectrographic analysis from the keep's own archive healer completed this morning. The chamber was very quiet. Elder Cora, at the far end of the table, was looking at the documents with an expression that had moved some distance from the careful neutrality of 4 days ago. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was still smooth, still controlled. But underneath it, for the first time in Everett's 30 years of knowing him, there was something that had the texture of a structure discovering it has been built on less solid ground than assumed. These documents prove nothing except that my brother has chosen a side. These documents, Everett said pleasantly, prove that the evidence supporting the petition is fabricated, which means the petition itself is built on false foundation, which means, under Section 14 of the Ashwood Compact, which I suspect you know as well as I do, it must be withdrawn pending full council review. The council? The council, Elder Cora said from the end of the table, and her voice had found something it had misplaced 4 days ago, a directness that suggested she was done being positioned. We'll take the morning to review these documents. The petition is suspended. Dorian looked at her. She looked back with the equanimity of a woman who has just made a decision and does not intend to revisit it. In the anteroom, Everett had spent 40 minutes the previous evening talking to Sola, not threatening, not persuading, simply showing her, in clear and documented detail, what false testimony in a legitimacy trial carried as consequence under pack law. What it had cost others. What it would cost her. He had also shown her, without drama, a document attesting that the Luna of Ashwood had personally funded the Southern Territory's healing post for 11 consecutive years without attribution, because she had not wanted credit, only results. Sola had been quiet for a long time after that. She had not appeared in the council chamber this morning. Dorian knew it the moment the door to the anteroom opened and a guard came to speak quietly in his ear. The recalculation behind his eyes ran faster. He looked across the table at Wren, at his brother, who had their mother's eyes and had apparently also kept their mother's meticulous genealogical records. And for one moment, something showed in his face that was not the careful armor. Something that was almost the look of a man who had spent so long planning for power that he had never once planned for being wrong. It passed quickly. The armor returned. "This isn't finished," Dorian said. "No," Wren agreed quietly, "but it's different now." Outside, the winter sky had begun to pale toward the particular silver white that preceded real dawn. The light that came before the light. The kind that changed the color of everything it touched. In the gray wood, Caleum stood at the spring. The fourth truth was waiting. He breathed in the cold air and the green earth smell of the clearing, and felt the bond, warm, steady, Mave in the roots behind him with 5 heartbeats moving in the gentle rhythm that had become the background music of his days here, and let himself stand fully inside the present, not the kingdom, not the petition, not 31 years of everything that had already happened. This morning, this clearing, this impossible, luminous, terrifying gift of 5 small lives not yet fully in the world, and the woman who had carried them and carried everything else, and had never, in 31 years, asked him to love her less carefully. The howl rose. It was not like the others. It was not quiet or contained or shaped by memory. It was the sound of a man fully present in his own life. in the fear and the wonder and the cold morning air, and the knowledge that the ground shifts and that you plant your feet anyway, together, and you hold. The great silver tree exhaled for the fourth and final time. The bark moved, the record sealed. In the roots, Mave went very still. Then, for the first time since they had entered the graywood clearing, the ancient roots that had curved around the hollow shifted. Slowly, gently, the way a hand opens rather than the way a door swings. And the path back through the forest reappeared, clear and frostlit, leading home. Bramble looked at the tree, looked at the path, looked at his bark annotations. "Well," he said, with the mild satisfaction of a man watching 4 centuries of documented theory complete itself in real time. "There it is." Wick pressed hard against Mave's left side. She pressed back. "Let's go home," she said. The path back through the graywood took 3 hours, and Bramble talked for all of them. He talked about the forest record, sealed now in the bark of the silver anchor tree, permanent and irrefutable, carrying the names of Caleum and Mave Ashwood and the notation of 5 legitimate heirs of the Ashwood line. He talked about the 3 previous occasions on which the law of the 5th howl had been activated, and what had become of the challenges in each case. All 3 had collapsed, he noted with scholarly satisfaction, not through force, but through the simple structural failure of lies built against documented truth. He talked about the correct way to prepare moss poultice for wolf pup delivery, which he had done 14 times and considered himself authoritative on, and about the dietary requirements of nursing she-wolves in the first month, and about the deeply questionable decisions made by the Ashwood Council in 1887, which he had opinions about and saw no reason to keep to himself. Caleum walked beside Mave with his hand at her back and let the old Omega talk, because the old Omega's talking was, he had learned over 4 days, the sound the clearing made when it was at peace, and he had come to find it oddly settling. Mave was quiet. Not the quiet of worry, the quiet of a woman walking toward something she has decided to meet fully, without armor, without the composed surface she had maintained in the council room 4 days ago. Her chin was level. Her hands were still. But her eyes, when they caught the winter light through the canopy, had a quality he recognized from every important threshold she had ever crossed. Open, clear, and entirely unafraid. The 5 heartbeats moved in the rhythm that had become familiar to him now. Colt, steady and deliberate. Flint, still and then sudden. Rue, attentive to everything. Bram, enthusiastic about the motion of walking even experienced secondhand. And Wick, pressed against the left side with the immovable conviction of a small wolf who has decided on his position and will not be argued out of it. They emerged from the tree line into the cold white light of the keep's eastern field as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent, and the first person Caleum saw was Everett, standing at the field's edge with the expression of a man who has been watching the tree line for some time and is relieved to have something to show for it. Beside him stood Wren. Mave stopped walking. Wren looked at her across the frost-white field with their mother's eyes and the specific stillness of someone who is not asking for anything, but is prepared to be seen clearly and to accept whatever that costs. He did not look away. He did not arrange his expression into anything useful or strategic. After a moment, Mave walked toward him. She stopped 2 feet away and looked at him with the directness that had made council members uncomfortable for 30 years. She took him in. The lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the document case under his arm that contained, Everett had quietly told Caleum, 3 pieces of evidence that had suspended the petition and bought the forest enough time to complete its record. "You stitched the banner," she said. Wren blinked. It was not what he had expected. "Not literally," Mave continued. "But you did what that requires. You found the thing that needed doing and you did it without waiting for permission or recognition." A pause. "Your mother would have been proud of you." Something moved through Wren's face that had no armor over it at all. He nodded once, and it was the nod of a man setting something down that he has been carrying since he was 11 years old. Inside the keep, the council chamber had taken on a different quality. Dorian's petition sat suspended under formal review, the false documentation flagged, the witness absent. Elder Cora had spent the morning reading the Greywood record, a certified copy delivered by forest law protocol to every pack council within the Ashwood territory, with an expression of someone updating several long-held positions simultaneously. The neutrals had stopped being neutral. There was nothing left to wait for. Dorian was in his chambers. Caleum went to him alone. Not with guards, not with Everett's careful legal scaffolding, not with the formal apparatus of an Alpha King addressing a challenge. He went alone because what Dorian had been done to his family, and that required a conversation between two people rather than a proceeding between positions. He found his nephew sitting by the window with the composed stillness that had defined him for 43 years, and he sat across from him and said nothing for a long moment, and let the silence do what silence does in the presence of someone who has built their entire strategy on controlling every variable and has just run out of variables to control. Dorian spoke first. "You know why I did it." "I know exactly why you did it," Caleum said. "You were prepared for this throne. From childhood, your grandfather told you it would come to you, and you believed him, and you spent 40 years becoming the kind of man who could hold it. That is not a small thing, Dorian. I have never pretended it was." Dorian was very still. "But a throne is not inherited by preparation," Caleum said. "It is inherited by line and by law and by the will of the pack. And the pack," he paused, "loves her. Not because she is Luna. Because for 30 years she learned their names and fixed their problems and stitched their banners and asked for nothing in return. You cannot win against that with a petition. You cannot win against it at all, because it is not a strategy. It is simply true." Dorian looked at the window. The winter light fell across his face and showed for a moment the man underneath the armor. Not a monster, not a caricature, but a man who had wanted something very much for a very long time and had chosen the wrong way to pursue it, and who was only now, in the full ruin of that choice, beginning to understand the cost. "The pups," Dorian said quietly. "5 heirs. The line is secure." "The line is secure," Caleum confirmed. "The Greywood record stands. No council, no petition, no document can touch it." A pause. "You will step back from the succession council. You will remain in the pack because this is your home, and I will not exile a member of my family for ambition. Only for cruelty, and you have not been cruel, only wrong. But you will step back, and you will live with what that means." Dorian was quiet for a very long time. "Yes," he said at last. One word. The armor still on, but underneath it, something that was almost relief. The specific relief of a man who has been fighting for so long that he has forgotten what it feels like to stop. 3 weeks later, in the warmth of the keep's inner chambers, Cirrus delivered 5 wolf pups into the world. Colt arrived first, gray-silver, steady, already orienting toward his mother's heartbeat with the certainty of a wolf who knows his direction. Flint came second, swift and silent, there and present before anyone had fully registered his arrival. Rue came third, golden cream and immediately attentive, her small nose reading the room with precise, unhurried focus. Bram arrived fourth with considerable enthusiasm and a volume that made Bramble, who had insisted on being present and whom no one had found a compelling argument to exclude, say there it is with the tone of a prophecy confirmed, and Wick came last, the smallest, white as the frost on the eastern field, stubborn about the precise angle of his arrival, and then suddenly there, fierce and certain and impossibly, heartbreakingly alive. 5 wolf pups, warm and breathing and full of the specific chaotic potential of things that have just begun. Caleum sat on the floor beside Mave, his back against the warm stone, her hand in both of his, and looked at the 5 small lives arranged in the curve of her body, and made the sound he had made in Cirrus's chamber 3 weeks before the forest. The one with no language. the one that was 31 years of hoping finally, completely, arriving. Bramble, from his chair in the corner, annotated something in his bark. Nobody asked what. The great hall of Ashwood Keep had never felt larger. Mave stood at its center, not because she had been summoned, not because a council required her presence, but because a young she-wolf from the Thornwood Quarter had come to her that morning with the specific frightened composure of someone trying very hard not to show how frightened they were. The council had questioned her right to her mate. Her legitimacy had been called into doubt. Mave had brought her here herself. The hall was full, not of neutrals, not of carefully arranged expressions, but of wolves who had known this Luna for 31 years and had no difficulty choosing a side. At Mave's feet, 5 wolf pups of varying sizes and levels of cooperation were arranged in a formation that was approximately orderly. Colt sat straight, watching the proceedings with serious gray eyes. Flint had already disappeared once and been retrieved from behind the tapestry. Rue was observing the young she-wolf with an intelligence that would, in a few years, be quietly formidable. Bram was sitting on Everett's foot and showing no signs of relocating, and Wick, white and small and absolutely certain of his own importance, had planted himself directly in front of the young she-wolf and was looking up at her with the expression of a wolf who has decided she is worth protecting and considers the matter settled. The she-wolf looked down at him. Something in her face changed. Mave leaned toward her and said quietly, what no one had said to her 31 years ago when she had stood in her own frightened composure, in a room that did not want to look at her directly. You belong here. Not because the council says so, because you do. And I will stand here with you until everyone in this room understands that. Caleum, at her side, said nothing. He didn't need to. His hand found hers, and 31 years of chosen love pressed warm against her palm, and the hall, their home, built from 3 decades of work and names learned and banners stitched and forest laws completed at dawn, held them both, and the 5 small wolves between them, and everything they had built together from the stubborn, luminous, undefeatable raw material of a love that had never once asked permission to be enough. It always had been.